Jill Escher, welcome to Conversations with Peter Boghossian and Christina Buttons, where it's a pleasure to talk to you. I have a funny story before we start. So my son is home now and he's visiting me. And I said, I have to go. I have to jump on a live stream. He said, well, what are you talking about? I said, I'm talking about autism. And he said, oh, is it with Jill Escher? Wait, what?
What?
Like,
how?
I was just like, but evidently you're the person to talk to about autism. And he and Christine is actually, we were talking about this as well. So if you don't mind,
Wow.
let's dive right into it. What is autism? And well, first of all, who are you? How did you get into it? And what is autism, which is the most important question?
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me and for addressing this really important subject that even your son knows something about. I'm Jill Escher. I wear a bunch of hats in the autism world. Most importantly, I'm the mother to two children with severe nonverbal autism. Johnny's now 25 and Sophie is 18. I have another son as well who's 27, but he's not diagnosed with autism. And over the years, I've become increasingly involved in the autism community on many, many levels. Right now, I serve as president of the National Council on Severe Autism, which, as the name implies, is a national advocacy group. I've been president of Autism Society San Francisco Bay Area, and I'm still on that board. And I run a philanthropy called Escher Fund for Autism that funds and promotes autism research, especially in the realm of causation and some other things too, but that's enough.
So what is it? And you wrote that the incidents have been increasing. Could you speak to us about that, please?
Yeah, well, you asked what autism is. Maybe we'll start there and then go into prevalence. What autism is a very sticky, tricky question, but generally what it refers to is a bunch of different characteristics and traits that kind of hang together in a kind of syndrome-like way, but it's not a syndrome. So it's classically defined in the DSM-5 as really two co-occurring traits. One is abnormal social communication, and the other is repetitive behaviors. And those can occur in many ways and to many different degrees, which is why we see all this heterogeneity. But in addition to what you see in the DSM-5, there are a lot of other things that tend to cluster, with autism. For example, sensory sensitivity. My kids are constantly plugging their ears. I have to put headphones on them, for example. Anxiety. My son suffers a ton of anxiety, which can become incredibly explosive. Other things such as, difficulty learning, inflexibility in behaviors, lack of abstract thought is really another kind of foundational part of autism. So it's really a lot of different things and they tend to hang together. And for lack of having a better diagnosis, clinicians slap autism on a bunch of different presentations, clinical presentations that have these combined to one degree or another and with different traits.
So you've written that the prevalence of autism is increasing. And so
Yes.
I was wondering if it's possible that the diagnostic criteria are changing or expanding rather than the rates of autism increasing.
Right. So that seems to be one of the most fundamental debates in autism. Are the rates truly increasing of this psychopathology, of this neurodevelopmental disorder? Or are we just changing the diagnostic criteria to encompass a greater number of children? And I strongly argue that it is the former, that we are actually seeing a very dramatic, very obvious increase in neurodevelopmental pathology among children in the US, but
I was just
also
going to say cross-culturally or
in the industrialized countries where we've done this epidemiological work. It's very evident that this is true, even when we hold the definition constant. Right? Even if we're looking at the objectively same criteria for inclusion, we see these dramatic increases. I can give you, one example here. I'm in California, and we keep very good data on our developmental disability population. We've done so for decades, really since the 60s and 70s, because we have a specific legislation that other states don't have. But what we've seen, for example, is an increase in autism in our developmental services system, which only serves the more severe portion of the autism population, from about 3,000 in the mid 1980s to over 180,000 today, right? And that is obviously increasing at a rate much higher than the general background population increase. When we look at the CDC data, again, they're holding the case definition constant, and other federal data. We see an increase from less than 1% 20 years ago to about 3% today. So this is, and I can cite dozens of studies across, from epidemiology to education to social services, to other forms of data that we see from, for example, hospital systems. The same exponential curve, even when we're holding the case definition constant. Now, that's not to say there isn't also an increase, especially in that very high functioning level that we're including that wasn't included before. I will also say that is true. So I think both are true, but what's so alarming is that even rates of the more profoundly impacting autism has increased.
So that causally, that a reasonable person can infer, in fact, the inference would have to be that it's environmental.
Yeah, so I would argue that this raises very important, urgent questions about what might be raising these rates of abnormal neurodevelopment. Because what autism essentially is, I talked about the behaviors and how it manifests, but what it is on the inside is abnormalities and dysregulation of early brain development, starting when the baby is a fetus, mid-gestation, when the neurons are being born and they're growing and they're proliferating and they're migrating and creating the brain. And what we've seen in the field of neuroscience is very, very strong evidence that autism, for the most part, there are exceptions, of course, but for the most part is the result of abnormal and dysregulated early brain development. So what is causing that? That is the $64 billion question in autism today.
Christina, I think you wanted to jump in.
And we still don't know all this time.
Yeah, well, that's what I work on. I mean, that's my philanthropy focuses on that very question, and we're actually finding very interesting, things and very worrying things, which we can talk about.
Have you found anything interesting with the cerebellum?
Well, okay, if we're going to talk about neuroscience, autism's complex, and they find different parts of the brain are affected differently in different people. There's not one thing, but there is one. If there is one bottom line, it is in the cerebral cortex, especially the frontal cortex. They find abnormalities in how the layers of the cortex are formed and how those neurons connect and how those synapses work. Now, I don't know. I mean, we probably don't want to get too deep into neuroscience. This is not a science podcast, but I would start there when we think about what's happening with autism and how it develops early in utero and how that relates to, as I said, there's these dysregulations that could be genetic, but could also have other causes as well.
Now, you used the word before, and then I have a few questions that are just pounding out of my brain that I have to discharge. But you used the term before, disorder.
Yeah.
And I know that must not be without controversy.
Mm-hmm. So language has been highly controversial in autism, as it has been in other areas of the culture war. So autism has been caught up in the culture war, just like so many other things. And it's been really unfortunate in my view, because I don't think autism is a culture war question. I think autism is a question of, pathology, of neuropathology, and how we address that scientifically and how we deal with it in terms of policy. Of course, everybody wants the best for our children with autism. I certainly want the best for my children. Sure. I want the best for our community. I literally spend hours every day serving our community, to make sure our kids are included to the extent possible, that they get access to the best programs possible, the best therapies possible, can live the best lives possible. I'm on board with that 100%. What I'm not on board with is this kind of systemic trivialization of autism, which you see in the scientific literature, which you see in the neurodiversity movement, where they're trying to wipe away words like disorder, like risk, like, oh gosh, there's so many of them. We're not allowed to talk about the severe behaviors of our children. We're not allowed to talk about the aggression, the property destruction, the self-injury, the elopement, the pica, like my daughter does, the ingestion of inedible objects. These things apparently we're not allowed to talk about because they cause stigma. Well, okay. Autism itself is not stigmatizing. That's not stigma. Comes from something else other than an essential part of your disorder, right? Stigma comes from, society or individuals, deciding that you are lesser than. Well, that's a secondary question. But what a lot of the neurodiversity advocates in academia, really entrenched in academia, are trying to do is kind of obliterate the vocabulary of autism so that we only have these neutral terms left. And those neutral terms do not adequately describe people like my son Johnny, who's 25 and nonverbal, has a functional level of probably an 18-month-old, if that, probably less than that, maybe more like a 12-month-old. He can't really do anything for himself. He can't dress himself. He can't prepare food. He can't take care of his own hygiene. He can't read. He can't write. He can't talk. He can't use a phone. He can't, functionally operate anything. Before he was on the right medication, he would consistently destroy the house. The house I'm in, you see bite marks on all over the windowsills, all over the doors. The furniture would be ripped on a regular basis. Even the carpeting would be shredded. I'd come in, I'd wake up in the morning and find the bathroom flooded because he had clogged the sink with something and ran the water all night. I mean, the stuff like this all the time, every day. It's a 24/7 thing, but we're supposed to not address that. One time, it was a couple of years ago when I was president of Autism Society San Francisco Bay Area, I wrote a blog post about my son had utterly decimated the interior of my Prius, right? So such that you looked in the back and all you saw were springs where the seats used to be because he had ripped apart the back of the car, among other things. And the neurodiversity movement really talk about cancel crusade. They really came down to my knee oh my God, how could Jill reveal these intimate details of her son's life? What? I'm not supposed to talk about this? This is one of the worst neurodevelopmental disorders in the history of humanity. I'm not supposed to share something like this? I mean, but this has sort of been an ongoing battle.
I mean, how do you deal with that? Yeah. How do you deal with that? I mean, it must be all
with
consuming.
The cancel crusades?
No, with your son's behavior.
Oh.
I mean, how do you,
Yeah. It got very ugly. I mean, as you could imagine. I mean, I spent, I don't know, a good 20 years living under a rock, basically, in some ways because of his behaviors. I mean, it was hard to even leave the house, as you can imagine. I couldn't travel, or we could travel, but it sometimes ended with a 911 call. It was extremely traumatizing for everyone in the family, especially his little sister, because at the end he started beating her up. And that's when I just drew the line and we had to get him out of the house because it was, I can't even tell you the amount of cortisol, we expended, just doing things like trying to keep them apart. And eventually we had to get him out of the house. He now doesn't live here anymore, which is why I'm able to do things like this podcast. He lives in a house near us in what I call a one-person group home. And he has staff 24/7.
Does he recognize you?
Oh, yeah. He knows his family, but he can't verbalize anything. Sometimes when a relative comes over who he hasn't seen for a while, you'll see him smile, you'll see recognition, but again, he can't say anything. He looks, and interestingly, and this is very common with autism, he's extremely handsome. He's extremely well built. He looks like a football quarterback. He has a very intelligent face, intelligent eyes. His IQ is probably all of 32. But he's not like somebody with like classical intellectual disability where you would look at them and you would say, oh, that's somebody with an IQ of 32. He looks, handsome, healthy, robust, manly man.
Can I ask you a sensitive question?
Oh, of course, anything.
So Peter Singer, the Australian ethicist, says that this is a hard question for me to ask, but you seem like a very open person, so I'm going to ask you. He said that with people he draws the line at 25, that if you have an IQ of under 25, we should basically, I read this, and I think the book was, I think it's Cognitive Disability and its Challenge to Moral Philosophy, something like that. Reed, could you pull that up, please? He said that we should treat people who have IQs under 25 exactly like we treat like cattle or pigs or anything. There's just like nobody home in there. Like, what would your response be to those arguments who claim that
people have said that to my face before. So this is nothing surprising. I gave a lecture once, and they're like, "Why did you even have children? Like, how dare you populate the planet with children, who are so defective?" Like, people would say this to my face. This is not new. Okay. I think if you didn't live the life I lived, you might not understand the incredible love and bond between, parents and their family and their children. And, and just recognizing their inherent value. Yes, of course, I know that his brain doesn't function, normally. Anyone can see this within half a second. Of course, I see that it's costing us and society a lot of money. Yes, I see that. But I see it differently. I see it almost the flip side of what he argues, that we have the absolute moral duty to protect and help create good lives for these people who cannot take care of themselves, who cannot advocate for themselves, who can't earn a living, right? Who can't build their lives and who are dependent on others for their health and happiness. So from my point of view, we have a real duty to them to make their lives good, not to treat them as cattle. My daughter, who I think, her IQ was like 37. Oh my God. She's the most she's unlike my son, like her character is very lighthearted and fun and delightful. She is the most delightful thing. Can she talk? No, she cannot read. She cannot write. She cannot, engage in the basic activities of daily living, right? She needs help with everything. But again, and she looks totally normal. She has a very intelligent face. She is the most delightful person. She brings joy wherever she goes. People love her. I mean, she's a great skier. She's a great swimmer. She loves music. She has a lot of enjoyment in life. And so I definitely do kind of bristle at this idea that, they lack inherent value because of their low functional skills.
I used to take care of, I used to be a respite caregiver. I know exactly what you mean. I used to take care of a young girl who had Angelman syndrome, and she was just delightful. She was a joy to be around. I loved just making her laugh. She's really like Snapchat filters. I introduced her to those, and we just had, I mean, she was a riot. She loved looking at herself with the rabbit ears and stuff like that in the screen.
Yeah, I mean, I think my kids in their way love life, and they deserve to have a good life, and as does everyone. It's not their fault, right? It's not their fault that my kids popped out of my womb, with brains that didn't develop normally. It is incumbent on us. Our moral duty is to figure out what happened. Our moral duty is to figure out what is causing this. And not only autism, I mean, autism rates are now really heading north of 3%. ADHD rates among children are north of 10% now. The last one I read was 11%. And we look, and there's also increasing rates of other, mental disorders in children. And it's our duty to figure out the F is happening. That's how I see it. Not to point fingers at them and blame them. They're blameless.
And okay. And so I'm trying to work through this myself. So you think we have a moral duty to provide for people who can't provide for themselves?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just thinking about the amount of money it must cost the taxpayer for the kids.
Yes.
I just a quick aside. I had a buddy of mine who was consulting a school district. I won't mention where it is, but they had two people in the school district. In the United States, we have a responsibility to educate all citizens up until they're 18. But these kids suffered from some pretty severe behavioral disorders that cost the city, I think he said $150,000 a piece, and they were brothers. And so he advised I'm telling you the story to get your take on this.
Mhm.
He advised the superintendent of the schools to literally buy these people a house in another city if they would move, because buying them a house would be cheaper than keeping them in the school system. And I was
Yeah.
wondering if there's any kind of a calculus, because the argument could be made that it's unfair to tax the taxpayer, as a moral, because if the argument is we owe these people something morally,
Mhm.
then the argument on the other side could be well, I don't want to be burdened financially because I have to pay. I was wondering, what would you say to that argument? What would you
Mhm.
respond to? How would you respond to that? If you think it's an unfair question, tell me.
Not an unfair question. I think it's a really super important question, and one that we should be talking about more, right, in politics and in elections and general policy debate. But I do want to be very honest here. When you say $150,000 a year,
That was a while ago,
that's
but
cheap.
yeah,
No,
that was a
that's
long
cheap.
time ago. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
when he told me that was a while ago. Yeah.
Oh, these kids, especially once they leave the family home, because the families either can't take care of them anymore because they're too elderly, or a mom gets cancer, or the dad has a stroke, or the kids, like my son Johnny, just can't stay at home due to health and safety reasons. Whatever the reason is, and of course, inevitably we die too. Let's not forget that. When they move out of the house, you see a hockey stick where the costs just go up astronomically. Parents are the greatest gift to the world in autism because we provide a lot of cheap labor. But I've known adults with autism who cost the state of California $1 million a year. Okay. I am not kidding you. More than $1 million a year in at least one case that I know of. These are outrageously expensive cases. So when I say we have a moral duty, we also have a pragmatic duty to figure out what is causing this and how to treat it. My son,
For sure. Yeah, for sure. 100%.
yeah, I mean, the costs are
You'd
huge.
get nobody would disagree with that.
I'm
Literally
not going to
nobody.
critify it. Like some people don't talk about the cost. I'm like, no, we have to talk about it. When you imagine your life, Peter, if you needed someone around you 24/7 for everything that you did.
I drive them crazy. That's Reed. That's Reed. That's what job Reed fulfills.
Yeah, but everything from brushing your teeth to preparing your food to driving you everywhere to making all of your appointments, everything. How much would that cost? Well, you can imagine it's not hard to do the math. Anybody could do the math and look at the minimum wage and then multiply that every single hour over 365 days a year, and you end up with an astronomical number.
How
I mean,
did you mentioned a few times, the IQ. How is that? Someone asked a question in the chat. How is that how is that measured? How do you test that
my
at those
kids
levels?
weren't officially tested because they weren't really testable, at least at that time. And so this was another instrument that was used in, I believe it was a school psychologist, I believe. So it was like a ballpark estimate. And I don't remember what the instrument was. And it's a fair question. I'd have to look back and tell you. But it had to do with their basic adaptive functioning relative to their age, which, and of course, their functioning was far below their age level. But yeah, it can be very, very hard to test IQ in people with autism.
Well, I really appreciated your article in the Free Press. I've been concerned for a while, sort of observing the neurodiversity movement.
Yeah.
I was introduced to it when I was diagnosed late with Asperger's when I was like 30. And what I observed there, it was very, very concerning. It seemed to there was this big conflict between the neurodiversity advocates, who are people who are kind of like me, who are sort of speaking on behalf of everybody, including parents with children who are profoundly disabled, and not even only the controlling what language can be used too, but also like what can be studied. Like they don't want you to search for a cause of
Right.
autism because they cite eugenics as a concern. They are trying to cancel the Autism Speaks organization, which they compare to the Nazi regime. And
Yeah, it's
all
so
kinds of things
stupid.
like that. ABA therapy is another one that they consider to be abusive, but I mean, I believe it can actually help some kids who are, have some behavioral issues and who are hurting themselves. Like it's not for those who have less needs. So I've been concerned about that for a while. I've watched some of them just sort
Right.
of rise to influence, and
Yeah, well, I've been a big target of theirs for a long time. Like they started targeting me in like the mid 2010s. I'm like, what's going on? Like I didn't understand what was happening.
because it's just been honest.
Yeah, I'm just telling my story, and I told my story in different ways, right? And each time I raised my voice, I would get these online pile-ons, right, by all these people. Usually, by the way, a lot of fake accounts, as we found out later. But that's another
Totally.
story. A
Totally.
lot of they have like manga, emoji
Yeah.
things, and names like Prickly Puss Superstar or whatever.
Yeah.
And anyway, they would pile on me, and I didn't know what was going on. But yeah, I think there were some people who were real people, not just the fake accounts, who really adhered strongly to this neurodiversity ideology. And the tenets of the ideology were really set forth in this book called Neurotribes by Steve Silberman, who's like
Yeah.
very super hard left wing politically, and kind of took his cue from the gay rights movement. He kind of saw autism as the next thing after the gay rights movement. And he himself was gay. I think that was a big part of what drew him to autism, was seeing it as the next frontier for liberation. Of course, he was wrong. Almost everything he wrote in that book was wrong, but it didn't matter. Facts didn't matter. The story really grabbed
Correct.
people. This idea,
Correct. 100%.
that autism is all natural. It's always been here. It's just part of a normal human. Yeah, it's a difference to be
Not a
celebrated.
disability.
Yeah, it feels good. Sounds good.
What do you think about you have any thoughts about the term weaponized autism?
I'm not sure I've heard that one.
Here
it is. Okay.
Yeah. Go ahead, read it out if you don't mind.
The focused application of nerdiness, computer tech savvy, and social awkwardness
It's just
in
a
the
meme.
cyber pursuit of justice, payback, or even serving the public interest. Real world results originating in social media, online forums, and other web locales. Oh, so that's what they were doing. They were doing weaponized autism against me.
I've noticed that the online autism community too there's a lot of crossover with other social justice topics,
Sure.
including trans stuff as well. But they also too, I mean, you'd expect like, oh, here's this vulnerable group of autistic people, but like I've observed them sort of in groups. It's just going after people who they accuse of being racist and things like that, and I've come to their defense.
That always has to come in. That always has to be brought in somehow.
Yeah,
We
no,
got to bring racism into
thing.
every conceivable
Well,
situation.
a lot of it is ad hominem attack, right? They don't often have a good argument. And so they turn things into ad hominem attack. So they'll call you, oh, you must be a racist and a transphobe. I mean, these things were lodged against me. Not remind you, not one iota of evidence. It didn't matter. It was just sort of part of the arsenal. Yeah.
So I have a very, very close friend of mine who has a son who has extreme autism, And he told me this story, which to you will probably be like, oh yeah, you'll just shrug your shoulders. But I was like, holy shit. He told me the story that they had some kind of a parental support group or something where people brought over their kids. And this one of these groups of one parent with their kids brought over a bunch of phone books. And basically all the kid could do morning, noon, and night was just sit there and just rip exact measurements from and like that's all he did the whole time. Have you heard stuff like you must have heard stuff like that? And then I have one question that's
sure.
eating at me.
Mhm.
All right, here's my go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Can you speak to that?
Well, yeah, as I said, one of the DSM-5 criteria is repetitive behaviors. And those repetitive behaviors can take all kinds of forms. Like, for example, I'm kind of a quasi mom to a man who's in his 30s who lost his parents who has autism. His repetitive behavior is talking about Disney films, right?
Yeah, that's what this kid does. He talks about the Lion King and some other things. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a looping in the brain, like the brain's not fully connecting. And so things kind of go in circles all the time. Now, that repetitive behavior can also be things like ripping, a phone book, or, in my son's case, it was ripping all the towels in the house. In my daughter's case, she doesn't have anything that distinct. It's mostly flapping her hands. It's, maybe doing the same kind of preschool games on her iPad. That kind of thing. She doesn't have vocalization, so it's not so much that, but they're all different.
So let me ask you a question that's really been, this is probably going to seem to you to be completely so trivial as to not even be worth bringing up, but I'm going to ask you anyway, since you're an expert in this. One thing I've noticed about people who have autism is they have just insane diets, like to the level of eating is one of my greatest joys in life. And I see people who have this, like my friend's son I was just telling you about, he only eats 3, and it has to be 3 hot dogs placed on a plate with nothing, no mustard, no onions, no. Oh, he used to do buns. I take that back. Do we know what the relationship, like, why is there like something stuck with, like, what's going on with that? Or is that just, is that false? Am I laboring under a false?
Not false at all. Extremely common.
Okay.
But it goes back to this repetitive behavior. It goes back to that inflexibility, right? But I think it's that inflexibility combined with sensory overload and wanting to control their environment very carefully. My son, very rigid, he won't touch meat.
What does he eat, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, he eats more now. I do want to interject something about my son that I should have said before after we moved him out of the house. He's one of those kids who medication did really help. So he ended up on a low dose of something called Abilify, which is an antipsychotic drug. It's one of the 2 medications approved by the FDA for use in autism, specifically to address irritability and autism. So he went on a low dose of Abilify, and almost overnight, his explosiveness went away.
Did his diet change when he was on the drug?
He became hungrier, because that happens with antipsychotics as it does with other drugs. You'll often see these autistic boys, especially boys, and they'll have this belly, and you're like, I know what medication he's on. It's very obvious. Unfortunately, he did gain a little weight, and his diet expanded somewhat. But for a long time, my husband used to joke all the time. He was, Mr. Cool Ranch Dorito. Like, that was all that he would eat for a long time. But now he eats rice and he has smoothies and a couple of other things, enough to keep him well nourished.
Okay.
That was my experience as a child. I only ate noodles with butter.
Oh, really? Yeah.
It expanded a little bit more to when I was like as a teenager, I mostly ate quesadillas.
What was it? Was it a sensory thing? Was it taste? Was it fear of the unknown? What was it?
It was, kind of all of those things. And today I have a lot of like food intolerances.
Oh, wow.
A lot of things I can't eat. So I still kind of gravitate towards the same things all the time because it's what I'm comfortable with, and I don't want to like get my stomach upset.
So I don't want to linger on this too much, but I'm so fascinated by it. So could you just, so is it and again, if this is just too weird of a conversation, just let me know.
Nothing too weird.
Okay. So is it that like the taste is scary to them, or is it that they don't like the taste, or they don't like what are they thinking? Like what's going on there?
I
Or
think
is
it's
there no
different
thinking?
for different kids, you know, as I said, sometimes it's just rigidity. Like I need to do the same thing all the time and I can't get off this path. Right. And that applies to food. I mean, I knew this young man, he was so rigid when his mom drove him to school or anywhere else in an abnormal pattern, like took a different turn, he would completely freak out because the map was already etched in his head so deeply that any deviation from that would make him crazy. And I think it's like that, you know, with food as well. Like I am comfortable with my pasta and butter, right? And you cannot put red sauce on it because my brain cannot venture out of its comfort zone. So, and I also think a lot of, and this goes to your, like, Christina, you
Yeah.
mentioned something about food intolerance. A lot of these kids have GI distress.
Yeah, the same for me.
Yeah, definitely. My son had it for a long time. He might still kind of.
From
And
eating the same foods?
well, no, it might be, but we don't really know why. It's more
Okay.
common, but it's clearly more
Very
common in kids and
common.
adults with autism than the general population.
What about
Um,
motor difficulties and balance issues? Do your kids deal with that?
oh my God, my kids are physically gifted. Yeah, so they're weird. Again, this is,
Huh.
again, with
Interesting.
autism, you have this patchwork, right? It's not like global delay often, it's patchwork. Like my daughter, as I said, she can ski black slopes in
Wow.
Tahoe. Like
I don't know what
she's,
that means.
she's a good skier.
Okay.
Like she's very coordinated and she can look down
Yeah,
the mountain and figure out all the steps to get down there, which
it's
takes a certain intelligence,
I've read
right?
something like 80% have some kind of motor imbalance issues. I was asking because that's
Yeah, not my
something I
kids.
deal with a lot, and I have
Yeah.
had a brain MRI that found cerebellum abnormalities, so that's why I was asking about that earlier, but
Oh,
it's something I
yeah.
just constantly walk into things, and I'm very uncoordinated. But I know that I mean, it's not everybody. That's what's
Yeah,
so
it's
interesting
not
about autism.
everybody.
It is
Some have, yeah, my son probably, if you asked him to walk a tightrope between like two skyscrapers, he probably could because he's so coordinated. I
Holy
oh,
mean,
moly.
wow.
Is it
yeah,
like, yeah, I mean, so is there, again, and I apologize for these super basic questions. This is
no
way
worries.
outside my area of expertise. So we have this idea. I don't think it's true. I think it's been debunked, but if you're blind, you can hear better. Is it like the people who have autism, they have a kind of superpower? They have something. I had a buddy in college of mine who had a just extraordinary recall. He had autism. I didn't know what autism was then, but just
Mm-hmm.
truly extraordinary recall. And I always thought he was, I didn't, that there was like someone feeding him something in a microphone or something. I didn't know what was going on. But is that
Yeah.
kind of common? Like you said, your kids are physically gifted with the black soul. It's like, is that common, or is it more like Christina said that they're just clumsiness or physical abnormalities or fear of the, and one more question, piggybacking that, is there a kind of like relationship, like if people who have autism, can you make a general statement and say they don't like touching other people?
I
That's
can't.
also that
I
also
can't make,
varies from person to person. It's
yeah.
like some
Okay.
so there's something going on where, like, some people have, like, hyposensitivity and then others have hypersensitivity, where some people really like physical touch and some people just really don't like it. It just depends on a lot of things.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's very individual. Like my daughter's super affectionate. She will hug and kiss, and I mean, she just loves people, and doesn't have that kind of aversion. My son, however, probably does have that aversion. But you asked about superpowers, and
Yeah.
that's been an issue. I think there's a general perception in the world that if you have autism, you must have superpowers of some sort, whether you're a great artist
Yeah.
or a great
Yeah.
musician or
I
like
think
great
that's true.
recall,
Yeah.
like, and that sometimes it is true. I mean, I know tons of people with autism who do have super. In fact, this weekend and the weekend before, I organized concerts featuring autistic musicians. Some of these guys can't talk at all, right? and they are excellent musicians, classical, jazz, rock, you name it. This one guy I'm friends with, Qiling Wu, look him up, people. He can play more than a dozen instruments incredibly well, right? And yet you can't have a conversation with Qiling. So it does happen.
Has there ever been an incidence where people have I don't like the term superpower, but I can't seem to think of anything else. Have a superpower who are autistic who can speak multiple languages? I would imagine the answer to that is no.
I haven't met such a person. Maybe someone exists, but the vast majority of people with autism are really quite disabled by their autism, and it's an entirely disabling condition. It isn't a condition that confers these benefits.
But
For
we
most
link
people,
high functioning and low
But
functioning under the word
that's
autism.
the problem with we got rid of Asperger's as a condition, and it
Yeah.
was sort of subsumed into the autism spectrum disorder umbrella in 2013, and that's where I think a lot of the issues we're currently having come from. Because I think neurodiversity movement, that would have been fine if it was just Asperger's. Like, yes, you have a difference, not a disability. That's fine, but they're just sort of speaking on behalf of everybody. They lean into dysfunction online, is what I see, because they're in these online communities and they're observing other people, and other people will say like, "Well, you don't seem autistic," and so they just sort of like lean into whatever it is that they conceptualize autism to be, and they like become more dysfunctional and disabled because of it. That's what my observation has been.
I would say, just generally speaking, the autistic diagnostic approach is in disarray, and almost nobody's happy with it, right? And Christina said, like, they got rid of Asperger's and they lumped it all together under autism spectrum disorder in the DSM-5. Well, okay. I mean, there's some justifications for it, but then what you have is this insane world where my son and daughter are lumped into the same disorder as these online people on Twitter who are like, or TikTok, who are like, look at me flapping.
Yes,
I'm so autistic. It's like there's no real like Venn diagram overlap between like my kids and these TikTok people. So obviously something has to be done to create greater clinical clarity. And I think there are various efforts. For example, the term profound autism was introduced a couple of years ago to describe those who really need 24/7 care. Oh, look, we have Rain Man on. So Raymond, would have been diagnosed with profound autism, even though he
the toothpick scene. There's the
a
toothpick
splinter
scene.
skill. Yeah.
One of the reasons I continue to use Asperger's, even though the advocates call me a Nazi for using it, is because I disagree with it being sort of removed as a diagnosis. That's the one I was given. That's the one I'm going to continue to use.
Yeah, I like that diagnosis because you kind of understood what it meant. It meant somebody who's cognitively intact, who has pretty much normal language, but suffered from these kind of suite of social sensory impairments, if you will.
That was my experience. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate they got rid of the diagnosis. They could have easily substituted it, at least today, with what I would call Baron-Cohen syndrome, if you know Simon Baron-Cohen's work, right? We don't like Asperger, right? He worked with the Nazis. He sent kids to death, right? From his clinic. Okay, understand, take away Asperger's, but Simon Baron-Cohen's work is very much connected to that like strata of autism. So why not name it that? Just rename it.
I'd be fine with that too. I mean, that was always my experience growing up. I actually was in special ed in high school and had an IEP and all of that, but they didn't actually recognize autism. But reading back on all of these psychological tests and things like that I had, I mean, they just, for some reason, autism or Asperger's in girls wasn't really well detected when I was a teenager. And so it wasn't really identified until I was an adult. But I
I read
had a lot
yeah,
of
go ahead.
social and sensory issues in school that made it where I would just get up and, like, walk out of the classroom because I couldn't handle it, and I got sent to the counselors so many times that they put me on, like, a individual education program and had so
Wow.
many psychiatric problems as a result of just such low self-esteem from not fitting in and not being able to make friends like everybody else that I
Right.
was
Mhm.
sent to residential treatment and group homes, things like that. It
Yeah.
was interesting.
Wow. I mean, as I like to say, sometimes there's no such thing as high functioning autism. I mean, because these
Huh,
things can be
interesting.
very impairing, even if you have clear cognitive skills that you possess.
Yeah.
These other things
Mhm.
can be absolutely debilitating. I hear you 100%.
But if
So,
I had caught it earlier, I just wonder if things would have been different and I wouldn't have struggled as much. I just don't
Mm,
know.
um,
I don't know.
a, a, a sensitive question. So I read an article about this is a while ago about it's going to seem like a total curveball, but it's actually not. Well, maybe a little bit, but it's relevant. Um, what they were struggling with in Holland, in that they legalized prostitution, and then they had people who were over the age of 18 who wanted to visit prostitutes, and it created a moral kind of an issue in the society. Like what should be, and I'm wondering, I asked the question because I'm wondering what are the, I mean, because I'm also thinking about the high functioning autistic person. I'm not really sure exactly where I'm going with this, but what about like consent among people who have autism, like sexual consent? Like, how does that work?
This is a really good question.
Oh, good.
Don't shy
Oh,
away
what
from
about
it.
I'm glad you
that
think so because I was feeling
documentary?
self-conscious about it.
Did you guys watch
Which
that new
one?
Netflix documentary about, Tell Them You Love Me?
Oh, I haven't seen it yet. Yeah, it's not
Oh
about
gosh.
autism per
No,
se,
not
but it goes to
autism,
the
but it's
consent issue.
yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, that is a story about facilitated communication. There it is.
Mhm. Which
Um,
is used for
Still used
s
today, yeah, with
Yeah,
yeah.
charters
nonverbal
debunk that
autistics.
totally. But
Yeah, it's highly controversial, but
what is
yeah,
the
back to
sexual
sex.
consent thing?
Well, okay, so let's start by acknowledging that, these kids, when they hit puberty, their hormones, for the most part, are functioning normally,
Okay.
and they will have a sex drive. They will often also have a romantic drive as well, depending on kind of where their level is. And this, poses a lot of challenges, for the individual, who's frustrated, for the parents, for the schools. And it's not easy. So if you're kind of lower functioning, I don't mind that word because it's accurate.
Okay.
If
Okay.
you're lower functioning, a lot of times, parents or therapists will try to work with the young adult on pleasuring themselves appropriately, like time for go to room, that's private time, that's not public time, go to your room, and trying to emphasize like how you deal with that privately so that it doesn't become an issue, say when you're at Trader Joe's and your son pulls down his pants or something, which by the way may or may not be something that happened to me. So um, there's that. And then there's also medical interventions there, in that sometimes a psychiatrist will prescribe something like an antidepressant that will
Oh, yeah,
decrease
that's right.
the
Yeah.
sex drive.
Yeah.
And there are other drugs that have been prescribed to do that. Um, and then for the higher functioning ones, like Love on the Spectrum, I think actually I really like that series. If you watch that, I think it was Netflix.
Haven't watched it.
Film, there's an Australian version and a
Mhm.
US version, and it was mostly higher functioning young adults with autism who were looking for love. And it showed them, their isolation, their loneliness, and the difficulty they had, finding a boyfriend, finding a girlfriend, or even knowing what to do with a boyfriend or girlfriend. Um, and I think,
Are,
that's also very hard. That they
are there
are
established guidelines for consent among people
so.
who suffer from this?
I wouldn't say established guidelines. There are efforts at sex education, right? For those who have the cognitive capacity, who can learn what consent means, and like when to say no, right? And what's a real friend, right? That's a certain, again, echelon of autism. For someone like my daughter, and I should tell you, we just went through this, there's something called guardianship broadly. So when someone turns 18, they're a legal adult and they're emancipated. However, if you're as impaired as my children are, parents will tend to want to get a guardianship. So you heard, like with Britney Spears, the controversy over her
Oh, yeah.
conservatorship.
For
So
sure,
in
yeah.
California, we call it a conservatorship. Other places, they call it a guardianship. Basically, it gives the parents the legal authority to make decisions for their disabled adult children. So that's
Okay.
what we have for our children. It was a struggle to obtain the power, right, to control her social and sexual relationships. The court did not want to give that to us because
She has sexual relationships?
she does not. Believe me, she does not. But we wanted to make sure that no one could take advantage of her. So so the court would give us the legal authority. But you have to understand, the courts are so very liberal, that they're like, they're loath to give away a power like that. But most parents, they can retain that. So legally, not practically, but legally, we have the authority to consent for Sophie. But in the real world, they have higher rates of sexual exploitation of children and adults with autism and IDD. You can see that very clearly in the data, and it's a big problem. It's a big problem. Staff sometimes at these group homes or in the day programs. I have a friend whose sister was raped in the day program. Couldn't resist, couldn't consent.
Did
It
she
happens.
even
It's a
know
problem.
what was happening to her?
It's hard to say. But she got gonorrhea.
Oh, that's how they found
And
out?
that's how they found out. Yeah.
What kind of facility was it?
This was in a day program.
God, that's awful.
Yeah. And they knew who did it, and they
Could
would
they
have prosecuted
speak?
the guy.
Why didn't they? Well, could she speak, and why didn't they prosecute him?
I don't remember the details, but I think it was. It may have had something to do with consent or evidence. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
In
But they
my
didn't prosecute.
experience, when I was a teenager, I was extremely naive, and I was sort of groomed online because I mean, this was like the very beginning of social media. It was MySpace, and so I was contacted by a predator, and that I ended up meeting, and I mean, there was a whole police involvement, everything like
Wow.
that. It was not good.
Well, I have to say, these people are socially, with autism, they tend to be more socially naive.
Yeah.
And they don't know. I have a friend, her son was catfished online, right? Somebody was pretending to be his girlfriend. Why? Because, she was extracting money from him. And, but he didn't know. He had no idea.
So let's drill down on that. So what do you mean? And excuse me if this is just extremely pedestrian. I'm trying to figure this out. That's why I'm asking. What do you mean by socially naive?
They can't.
Trusting.
Yeah.
You take people at
vulnerable.
Yeah.
They can't read cues.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a seemingly unusual question that comes with a host of assumptions. Let's say that everybody has a threat meter in them, and that threat meter is capable of accurately assessing the threat of a situation. You're on a bus, subway, walking home at night, what have you.
Mm-hmm.
Some people, and I think I fall into this category clearly, some people have a threat meter that's miscalibrated too high. So I think I see threats when there are no threats. In fact, I know this is the case. You have a kind of low level paranoia. But in my case, maybe it's somewhat justified, but I had it before I entered the culture war. Do autistic people have the threat meter that's calibrated too low?
Yes, but I think that is part and parcel of their failure to develop strong abstract thought. Part and parcel of their inability to read social cues, to draw inferences, to understand subtleties in conversations. And they're very literal. They're often very, very literal, and they can't understand little stories or quips that aren't,
Okay, so
tangible.
if you buy, and I don't mean an actual threat meter, there's no gauge in one's brain, but if you buy the idea that we all have threat meters and some, like my own, is miscalibrated too high, would it be safe to say, in other words, I see threats when they're not, and I perceive danger when there is no danger, or I think there's more danger when there's actually less danger?
Mm.
Is it reasonable to say that many, maybe even most autistic people, their threat meters are calibrated too low?
Oh gosh, yes. I mean, and that can go from anything from crossing the street. So for example, like my kids do not understand crossing the street, right? My son will just bolt across the street. Doesn't matter if there's a car racing down the street at 80 miles per hour. Oblivious, right? He's unaware of danger. My daughter, for example, I mentioned she has pica, which is the eating of inedible objects. She doesn't understand that if she eats a little toy that's like this, it might get lodged in her intestine, right? Or might choke her, right? She doesn't understand something as simple as that. And then, of course, when you get to kind of a higher level of complexity, which would be something like somebody trying to manipulate you into exploitive sexual relationship, like they'd have no defense, they'd have no comprehension of it. So I think that's common.
Or in that applies in the physical domain as well, in terms of like walking down a street at night or being on a subway and seeing hooligans get on and their threat meter. Okay, interesting.
No, they wouldn't know. Not at all. Not at all. That's why, I mean, when I say like our kids need 24/7, I'm not kidding. They need 24/7. They need people to be their eyes and ears and protectors. I mean, even this, as I said, I help kind of parent a young man in his early 30s, the guy who talks about Disney films all the time. And he's verbal and he's very social. He loves people, loves traveling, loves doing new things. Great guy. But he would not have any, if someone came to his door, knocked on the door and said, "Hi, I have a present for you," he'd be like, "Come on in." It wouldn't occur to him that this could be somebody who's here to take advantage of him. Right?
Mm.
Well,
it's quite a disability.
One of my worst
Autism
nightmares.
Is quite a thing.
That is an extreme disability. That's just it makes you vulnerable to the world, and it makes you vulnerable to things you can't. It's like it's kind of a reflexive problem, and that the problem is contained within itself. Like you can't turn up your threat meter to make it more accurately assess the danger in the same way, in a kind of way that I can't turn it down. But the difference is, at least I'm cognizant that it's mine is calibrated too high. Hey, we have two quick super chats. Dutton Heifer for $4.99. And I got a new computer, by the way, on my new computer, so I can actually see things now. I couldn't tell the dollar signs before. There is an opportunity money at funding these programs where they come from at the expense of examining potential causes. Where is the ethical line drawn? How do you interpret that question?
I think he's saying
potential causes for autism.
I think he's saying, like, if you have a fixed amount of money and you could either pay for programs or pay for finding causes, which one do you choose? Right? Like, I'm with this moral dilemma. Like, it's the train track. Do you do this way? Or
okay.
Well, it would have to be causes, because the number of people affected in the future will be far greater. I mean, it's a utilitarian calculus there, right?
Personally, I think there's nothing more important than identifying causes of autism and related developmental disabilities. I mean, obviously, these people need care, and we need to enhance and increase their programs as well. So obviously, it's both. But my personal passion is causation.
Well, cool. Your article in the Free Press, should we talk about RFK Jr.?
Well, let's do one more. Let's do one more. One more super chat, and then we'll go on. That was a great article, by the way. Mushy Season, friend of the show, £5. Could it possible that autism is a mutation, a response to our increasingly fragmented and insular societies?
Well, it's certainly heritable. A mutation, about 14% of all autisms, actually somewhere between 10 and 14%, we'll give it 14% of all autisms are caused by a genetic mutation, usually a rare de novo mutation in the sperm or egg of one of the parents.
Wow. Interesting.
But the remaining 86% of autisms, we don't know. But it's heritable. And so that brings up a question in my mind about what's causing these heritable effects. Why is it that I, who has no autism up her family tree, my husband has no autism or anything like it, up our family trees, no risk factors in my pregnancies, why would I have not one, but 2 kids with severe autism?
Yeah.
In my mind, it brings up questions about my eggs, or if you will, my husband's sperm, right? What is happening to create this heightened risk for abnormal neurodevelopment in our children? If you have one kid with autism, you have about a 19% chance of a recurrence having another kid with autism. It's really high recurrence. So it brings, and again, it's not classically genetic. So it brings up questions about what was usually called epigenetics and kind of non-genetic factors that are heritable. So that's what I do, but it's very sciencey.
Wow. Interesting.
I don't know how sciencey, y'all want to get.
Yeah, no, it's good. Well, we got another super chat here. The Inner Light. Oh, that's from season 5 of Star Trek: The Next Generation. Thank you. One of my favorite episodes. 20 pounds. While you're at reading super chats, which we're doing now, a big thank you for doing all these talks. Love the recurring collaboration with Christina Buttons too. Look at that. That's very good.
Someone likes me.
Yeah, you're loved. You're a revered
Yay.
figure. Keep hanging out with me, and everybody will start hating you pretty soon. That's good. So there's so much to talk about. But Christina, talk about her article in the Free Press, which was wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I think it came up. The news draw were comments made by RFK Jr. about vaccines and autism, and I think your article addressed some of those.
Yeah.
I know I've been kind of debunking those conspiracies for a very long time as well. It's been an interest of mine ever since, all that stuff with Andrew Wakefield, but it just never dies. I mean, there's been so much money and so much research that has gone into studying the link between vaccines and autism, and it's like that's the one thing we know for sure isn't causing it. So, but
the vaccine hypothesis that wouldn't die. I mean, yeah, it's really quite abundantly clear that vaccination is not a risk factor for autism, and that hasn't been driving these increasing rates of autism. I mean, it fails on every level. It fails on the level of epidemiological studies, which find no connection. It fails on developmental biology level, and that you really don't have a mechanism of action that can connect postnatal vaccination with abnormal development, right, of a fetal brain, essentially. I mean, it also, I think, just fills a void for people that is understandable. So I want to say that, like, I have a lot of friends who still kind of question, whether their kids' autism was caused by vaccines, but I have empathy for it because science has left us a giant void. They have really failed to figure out what is increasing these rates of autism, what is raising risk in an individual family like mine for autism. They've fallen flat on their face, in my opinion. So I have some sympathy for these people. But when the research is so clear, you have to walk away and start asking different questions.
Exactly. I mean, it's been going on for so long now. I think the reason people suspected vaccines was because autism was typically sort of detected around like a year and a half shortly after you get a round of vaccines.
Yeah, like 2 and a half. Yeah.
And then something like that. And then, like the goalposts have kept moving. So first it was, it was like the MMR vaccine, measles, mumps, rubella. Then it was like the thimerosal, and then it was too many vaccines. And then I still can't believe we're still talking about vaccines and autism.
Yeah, and not only that, vaccines protect children from horrific
Yeah.
infections, that can cause brain damage,
Yeah.
right?
Let me ask you a terminological question, and it's not a politically correct question. It's just a kind of I've heard people with autism referred to as autists.
Mhm.
Is that like a thing?
Well, I think it's, again, that's sort of a piece of the culture war,
Yeah.
right? That it becomes an identitarian movement,
Yeah.
right? So it's not about, it's this resistance to the medical definition of autism, a medical view of autism, right? Which is what I certainly see it as. It's more of a cultural, an identity approach
Interesting.
to autism. So the identitarians will say it's not a person with autism, it's an autistic, right? Because that's their identity,
Mhm.
that's who they are, right?
It's
They're
hard
an
to keep up
autistic.
with all of
Yeah,
the different
the language wars.
the language changes where it's like they just decide like, no, that's outdated. Now we have to move to something else. It's very
Yeah.
dizzying.
Yeah.
So,
So
uh, uh,
autist is part of that.
so let me let me ask you another question. Has there been any? This is kind of a curveball question. Sorry, I just ask people whatever's on my mind.
Sure.
Has there been any research on? Just warning, it's a very curveball question. Um, People who have autism and do DMT, or people who have autism and do psychedelics.
Um,
Christine is looking very puzzled.
Well,
She's looking.
I mean, that's more something
it's
of
not a
some
weird question. No.
Oh my God, I love you. You're my favorite guest.
No,
Weird
this is not a
question.
weird
This is
question.
good.
I will tell
Okay.
you, in the early days of autism, and this is the 1960s, at UCLA, there was a professor there called Lovaas. He's known for his behavioral therapies, which, by the way, are really over acclaimed. I mean, the evidence for his work is underwhelming. But anyway, so during this time, they would use LSD, if you can believe it, on children with autism,
Yeah,
thinking that psychedelic experience
I had
would,
remember reading something. That's why I asked. That's one of the reasons I asked. Yeah, go ahead.
I always
yeah,
liked LSD.
and it didn't help. But there is talk about kind of the microdosing techniques,
Yeah,
and
that's where I was going with
I
that too.
I
Yeah,
have
yeah.
talked to researchers who were, I don't know if they actually got the IRB to do that work, but who were talking about doing that work. I'd have to look it up to see if that work progressed. It's not a weird question. Listen, people have been thinking of every possible dart to throw
Yeah.
at this to see if
That's
anything will help.
because I know, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but I know that I just had Andrew Gallimore on the show, and he posted something on his page about connectivity with microdosing and some of the effects that people doing, and I think that's like throwing darts. And I wonder if that yielded any fruit whatsoever. So I apparently not, or we would have heard about it. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I'm sorry that I don't have it off the top of my head, but
No, that's why I said it's a weird one. All right, we have an inner light. The inner light once again for 20 pounds. Pete, I really named myself after that Star Trek: The Next Generation episode. And do you two know about Star Trek: The Next Generation? Okay, you're both dead to
That
me.
was never one of my special interests. It was
That's what a
Lord of the
shame.
Rings was a big one, and
What a shame. You're dead to me. How awesome of you to notice. Make a video.
Mhm.
We talked about Star Trek already, but yeah, that's good. Okay, so as I try to like wrap my head around this, and I think one of the things that's difficult for me is the inner light. This is an amazing episode, truly awesome. As I try to wrap my head around this, I think the thing that makes it difficult for me is it's not univariate. Like it just manifests itself in so many different ways. And I think it's hard for me to understand, like even the difference between your son and daughter, it seems very extreme. And so it's just hard for me to get around that. And I'm thinking about like navigating this. And maybe this is a ridiculous question, although given my other questions, maybe it's not ridiculous. I don't know. Is there a way when we, and again, if you don't like the term high functioning autistic person, we don't have
oh,
to
it's
use that.
fine.
Okay.
yeah, I don't.
It's a
It doesn't
useful
bother
term.
me either.
Okay. Are you cool with that, Christina?
Yes, I
Okay.
don't have any particular
Yeah.
feelings about language. It's just
Yeah. I don't language police myself
Yeah.
either.
Okay. So when we meet someone who's a high functioning autistic person, like, is there a different way like that we should engage them, or is there kind of like I mean, is there? I mean, I don't know. Like when you communicate, is there like something that would make them more comfortable, or something? I mean, I don't really know how to articulate the question, but a way of communicating with them that would be less abrasive or harsh.
Well, I prefer direct communication because I have a lot of trouble just sort of reading between the lines when people are not direct. And I not it's like nothing anyone says can hurt my feelings, but sometimes people try to avoid saying things a certain way to avoid that. But
So
I
forthright is that safe to say, or is it's just so varied? The vagaries of the autistic life are just too
well, that's
much to.
the thing. It's different for a lot of people because there are a lot of like neurodiversity advocates who are very like sensitive about things. And that's where all these like language words come from. But
Mhm.
for me, that personally, I just prefer people to be very direct so that I don't have to do any guesswork. Because if you don't say exactly what you mean, I don't know what you mean.
Yeah, I find, my friends with high functioning autism, um, I find the most connection to them through their interests, right?
Oh,
Like I will
interesting.
know, like if I know this one guy who loves certain video games, and I will always ask him about his video games, and it will put him at ease, right? My friend with Disney, we'll talk about that, and you get a connection through their world, not your world.
Huh,
They're
interesting.
like, this concert that I organized with autistic musicians. I was telling this guitarist who has higher functioning autism. I
Huh.
said, you really should learn the song City of New Orleans because he loves trains, right? And he goes, only if I want to. It's like, do not like this is my world. You come into my world, Jill. I'm not,
That's
not
so
listening to you.
interesting. He loved trains. I have a very good friend of mine. I kind of lost a little touch with him, but he's pretty severely autistic. But his superpower is trains. Like he has an insane, like truly
Mm-hmm.
insane.
Oh
And
yeah.
he was the lead coordinator for a train. This I think it was Amtrak. And I mean, you could not possibly have found a better person to. I mean, you couldn't have found. This guy was like worth 10,000 people, 100,000 people. He had just a photographic memory of like he knew exactly what times things came in, and it was crazy. And
Oh, for sure.
yeah, that, and he had a remarkable knowledge of history. All right, we got another um B, I don't know how to pronounce that, for 999. Have you considered having your DNA examined to human longevity? Uh, Craig Venter claims they find genetic indicators
There's a
than other published
there's a
studies
big
data.
Spark research study where they will pay you to submit your saliva, and they're trying to find genes associated with autism.
Yeah, the world's largest autism genetic study is the Spark study that Christina just mentioned. It's funded by the Simons Foundation, which was funded by Jim Simons, who just passed away this year, a major philanthropist. I was actually on their community advisory board for years. My children are enrolled in it, and they're, of course, negative. Only about 10% of their cases come back with a positive
What
finding.
What do you mean
Um,
negative? What do you mean?
Negative, they have no genetic cause, my children. And that
They
happens
have
about
no
90% of
genetic cause.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Do
But
you see, Peter, why I am obsessed with the question of
Yeah,
causation? Here I have these two kids with unbelievably florid disability, and science hasn't come up with one idea, one plausible idea, not a single one that could explain it. Now, I again, I think that
again, in the
we'll get.
history in this will establish the pedigree of me asking you weird questions. But
Mhm.
Sam Altman, the AI guy, just came
Yeah.
out and said he thinks that all physics is going to be solved by AI very soon, something like that. Read, can you find the exact quotation? Do you think that we're going to are you doing any Hail Marys with AI and autism? You think that we're going to be able to develop?
Other people have asked me that, and
Oh,
I'm not technologically sophisticated enough to give an informed answer, except I think AI could probably be useful in two senses. First, to help us identify risk factors.
yes,
Big
yes.
data has already been used in a couple of studies with some really intriguing results. And second, I think AI could be used to help kind of automate some of the support that our kids constantly need to bring down costs. So these are long-term questions, but yeah, certainly it's a tool that should be brought to bear. And I don't know if you know this, but it's now public because his ex-wife is RFK's running mate. But Sergey Brin has a daughter with autism.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he has a huge foundation. And I wouldn't be surprised to see a lot of his foundation dollars going towards more technology-oriented interventions and, maybe even scientific questions.
Is there something that we should do when we meet somebody who has an autistic child, maybe a severely autistic child like my buddy? Is there something we should do to like help them or say something to them or like?
Yeah, as my friend says, autism isn't a casserole disease, right? Like, oh, you're in the hospital, you get a casserole. Like autism's not like that, right? It's not a casserole. So what do you do? And I think it's just to remain their friend, because also, often the autism parents become very isolated. They find it very hard to get out of the house, to when they go to the park, right, their kids aren't playing with the other kids, their kids aren't in soccer, they're not the soccer moms in the camp chairs, cheering and clapping, they miss out on all of that normal stuff. I think just remaining their friends is important in itself. What I do in the San Francisco Bay Area is like literally like every weekend we're putting on events for autism families, because we're very aware of this isolation and we want to give them places where they feel good and comfortable and get together. Every Sunday we have a pool party for 3 hours. People sometimes drive 2 hours to come to our pool parties with their autistic kids because they don't feel welcome anywhere else. So making them feel welcome, making them, making their lives as normal as possible, again, is in itself powerful. But I don't like this thing like, oh, God would not have given you a child if you couldn't handle it, or
Well, you don't have to worry about that from me.
It's like we don't need to be pandered to like that.
Yeah. What do you have anything you have anything you want to leave people with? Like, what should they know? What should they do? What can they do?
Well, can I bring up a left field thing?
Well, that's the whole podcast.
when Christina, texted me, I knew of Christina and I knew of her writings in gender dysphoria, and the whole, trans issue and how thoughtful, she's been in approaching these issues. She obviously reads the research carefully.
Excellent. Yep.
I wanted to bring up something more to Christina, than to you, Peter, which is, while I completely understand kind of how important cultural context is and the sociological dimensions of, a child maybe identifying as trans or wanting to undergo transition or whatever other gender issue they're facing. I understand there are cultural issues, but I want to say I think something's really missing from the public discourse about this phenomenon. Like there's been a 38-fold increase in people who identify as trans by Gallup poll measure. So 1990 to like 2021, 38-fold increase, which is insane. It's a huge amount. And I would like to suggest that we aren't looking at possible biological drivers of it. And I think we need to inject that into the conversation. And I just want to share my own experience. Obviously, I'm not trans.
Please.
I'm not trans. But when I was long ago, when I was 45 years old, I discovered something really that flattened me. And it was that when I was a fetus in 1965, my mother had been given huge ongoing doses of synthetic steroid hormone drugs, which were very commonly given to women who went of a certain socioeconomic level who went to these early fertility treatments. Now, I don't know if you ever heard of diethylstilbestrol or DES, which was a synthetic hormone. Peter, you think you remember that whole
Yeah, I'm old enough now
disaster,
to know. Yeah.
catastrophe, right? Untold numbers of pregnant women were given synthetic estrogen drugs during pregnancy because the thought was that it would help their pregnancies. Well, it didn't. But that was only one of these synthetic steroid hormone drugs. I was given at least 5 different synthetic steroid hormones. Well, for 8 months, like while my mom was pregnant with me. So I was a fetus, right? They didn't inject into me, they injected in my mom, but I was affected. But I really delved, as a consequence of that, I really delved into the literature, the history of what is the history of these synthetic sex steroids that no one seems to know about and talk about, even though they're incredibly prevalent. And they were given in high doses to pregnant women until last year, when the FDA finally took the last of them off the market. It was called Makena. It was a synthetic progesterone. And I just want to say, there are a couple studies looking at the gender development effects of these hormone drugs. They're not enough, but they certainly hint at sometimes, clear socio-sexual developmental impacts of these drugs. And people don't want to hear biology, and they don't want to hear about how sex steroids,
No, we have a smart
combine.
audience.
But,
We have a
yeah.
we have a legitimately smart audience.
Yeah, but these sex steroids are very powerful, and just a little bit of testosterone will change a fetal genitalia completely, right, and the whole urogenital system completely, right?
Yeah.
And just small doses of fake hormones or exogenous hormones can alter the developmental trajectory of a fetus, and I would also say of their offspring as well, for
Yeah.
epigenetic things. I just feel like we have a huge toxicological history here that hasn't entered the mainstream discourse.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. Like, I think gender nonconformity, that's caused by sort of like prenatal gonadal hormone exposure, that's very high in a lot of, autistic people or those with Asperger's. It's Gender nonconformity is also very high in children who later grow up to be gay. And
Yep.
these are two populations that we see a lot who are coming to identify as trans today. This just sort of explosion in young people sort of identifying as trans. And what we also see is a lot of very influential, prominent scientific organizations and civil rights organizations, they've sort of altered what it means to be transgender, where now they're sort of defining it as an umbrella term that is like conflated with gender nonconformity. So I think a lot of young people are correctly sensing that they have traits, physical traits even, but also interests and preferences and things like that that aren't stereotypical for their sex. They deviate from the stereotypes associated with their sex. So I think they are like sort of correctly sensing their gender nonconformity, which is often caused by prenatal hormone exposure. But there's, due to this new definition of what it means to be trans, they're calling themselves transgender now. That's one of the things that I've seen.
Yeah, I agree with you. I do think that there's some genuineness to it, right? They sense something's off, something's different, right? And then they don't know quite how to categorize it. I think the culture does sometimes move them into the transgender box, which may or may not be the correct box. But I'm saying I do think there's something genuine going on here in terms of the increase in this gender bending phenomenon.
Right.
I think the gender
that'd
bending
be really
phenomenon is
interesting.
probably, in part, as I said, biological, not
I
just
think it would
sexual.
be interesting to look into that more. The hormones you were talking about.
Yeah, it's hard to get researchers
I was just
interested
gonna
in.
Yeah. I was
But
just thinking that.
there's some studies, and there was actually a study done on me when I was a child that related to
Oh,
how I was changed by my exposures because I was so heavily exposed. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I don't want to again go into all the details, but I just want to see the discourse think and learn more about the history of these very powerful drugs that were given to millions and millions and millions of pregnant women for decades.
Yeah. I mean, that is what direction we should be going in. And the problem right now is people are kind of stuck on this idea of like innate gender identity, which a lot of people can't even really define, where they describe it as some kind of transcendent sense of
Spirit.
gender or something like that. But like, no, there definitely are definitely prenatal hormone exposure. There's something going on there for sure, but
Yeah.
we need to kind of steer away from some of these like oversimplified explanations, because I think a lot of people who are kind of on the spectrum and they really like those simple black and white explanations like, oh, I feel different because I'm trans and transitioning is going to make me all better. I see a lot of that. I did kind of a survey of detransitioners, and I asked them sort of questions related to autism. A lot of them, I got some pretty interesting insights.
Cool. We have to. We're running up against a very hard out, but we got a super chat. Well, the Inner Light is killing it today for us. Thanks. We're a small nonprofit, so we appreciate that for 50 pounds. How Jill Escher talks about making people feel welcome at a pool party. It really sounds wonderful to me. It sounds wonderful to me too. We all have our baggage to carry, but someone just wanting to make people feel welcome is really touching and beautiful. I couldn't possibly agree more. I think that's absolutely wonderful of you to do and to create that sense of community. So good on you, as they say in Australia. I think that's fantastic. I've asked my buddy, like, if I could do anything, but there's no way I could help stay. I mean, like, it's no, the answer is no.
Well, no, you're helping now, Peter. You're helping by having frank discussion about some of the realities of autism. You're helping.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on and talking to Christine and I about this, because it's something that is not getting enough attention. And I am also fascinated in the recent increase in autism. And maybe, I don't know, maybe like if I were researching this, if someone were to say, okay, like, you have carte blanche, what do you want to do? My response would immediately go to take a look at the diagnostic criteria cross-culturally and then make cross-cultural evaluations and then work backward from that. Okay, Mushy Season gifted Peter Boghossian and 5 memberships. Thank you. Christine and I say thank you. Okay, so Jill, what anything else? Final thoughts? Where can people find you, etc.?
Oh, you can find me at jillescher.com. ESCHER. Oh, there I am. Look, God, I read my mind. And I have links to various writings and presentations on there. My contact information is on there. And yeah, I just feel like my final thought is this. We need to have a good dose of humility when we talk about autism. There are a lot of people who talk with like a huge amount of certainty about things. And that's just wildly premature. We are really in the infancy of understanding this phenomenon, what is going on. There are vastly more questions unanswered than are answered. And we just all need to be a little bit more humble, a little bit more kind as we work through this together and try to solve it. And there I am. I'm on Twitter.
Yeah, I really appreciate the fact that I think that this is just so important. Like, you took a situation and then you owned it, in a sense. Like, you tried to do something to make the world better, as opposed to kvetching or pissing and moaning or freaking out or saying you're a victim or anything. I just so respect that attitude, and the fact that you're trying to help people deal with these problems is just an extraordinary thing. So for humanity, I'm grateful.
I appreciate it too.
Yes. So thank you, Christina. Thank you, Miss Escher, to be the formal, and stick around. And thank you, everybody, for your super inner light. Thank you everybody for coming. I appreciate it. Again, Jill, very sincerely, thank you for so much. Thank you for everything you do.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for watching. Everything we do is under the umbrella of the National Progress Alliance, nationalprogressalliance.org. It's a nonprofit, independent 501c3. Your generous donations keep us going and keep fueling content like this. So please help us out. Make a donation. We very much appreciate it. Thank you.